Hearty good afternoon to all. Welcome to our 12th session. Today we are having a topic on respiratory symptoms that will be taken by Dr. Rajam Iyer. So we can start with the ma'am's presentation. We can have it for around 40 to 45 minutes, followed by 15 minutes of discussion. By 4, we can have our case presentation, followed by its discussion. By 4:30, we can wind up our session. Thank you all for joining in. Over to Sunil sir.
Thank you, Rajlakshmi. We have another important session today, which many people will experience during the course of the illness. This is not restricted to cancer patients, but any other patients can experience this, and it's a common symptom more towards end of life also. Uh, and So this session will be taken by Dr. Rajam Iyer. She's a pulmonologist working in Mumbai, but she's a palliative care physician as well. So she's on both roles. So we will hear more about how to approach the respiratory symptoms from Dr. Rajam Iyer. So it's over to you, madam.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I just wanted to also check with you the profile of people who are attending this.
So all the participants are postgraduate students of Trivandrum Medical College who are doing post-graduation in physical medicine and rehabilitation.
Okay. So they're all MD students.
Yeah.
Okay, fine. Great. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I hope you can see my screen. Sunil has already introduced me, so we will get straight to the topic. And the first important thing what we will go through is that the concept of need for palliative care and palliative approach in respiratory symptoms. Especially today I will be talking of the management of respiratory symptoms with the palliative care hat on, and the fact that respiratory diseases also require a palliative approach. It's not just cancer and related subjects, it's also respiratory medicine that needs a palliative approach. The second is I will go through a little bit in detail of what is chronic breathlessness syndrome. It's important for us to know this important entity because it's not taught to us in MBBS. A little bit about morphine and the myths about morphine in breathlessness, and then touch on other respiratory symptoms. I would like this to be an interactive session, so please, whatever questions, put it on a chat and we can address. I'm sure Rajalakshmi or whoever at the end, we can discuss it. I know we have a case, but in case during my talk you'll want me to answer some queries or go slow, please do not hesitate and stop me and we can clarify all your doubts. So first of all, we need to get into this notion of the fact that even people who are non-cancer, which is the main focus of my palliative care medicine, which is that I focus on non-cancer palliative conditions, of which, because I'm a pulmonologist, respiratory diseases and respiratory symptoms form a large chunk of my practice. So the need for palliative care also in respiratory conditions. So if you just see the kind of diseases that affect Indians, you will see that a big chunk is tuberculosis, COPD, asthma, diabetes, heart disease, stroke. So if you add up all that, you realize almost close to 45 to 50% of Indians are affected by these conditions. And this is the data somewhere around 2016, 2017, where we need to focus that the non-communicable diseases percentages in India is very, very high. Of course, we do have a lot of cancers, but if you see in the whole picture or spectrum of illnesses, cancer comes much lower. We do add 1 million new cases of cancer every year, and probably a lot of them come in advanced conditions requiring palliative care. But we have a whole lot of other conditions which are non-communicable diseases which affect a lot of Indians, and therefore we need to realize that those are the conditions where we need to focus our attention also as a palliative care approach. Because today, if you see, the current statistics show that we have 18% of the world's population, but we have 32% of the world's burden of chronic respiratory illnesses, which means it is way more than what is there in the rest of the country. So it has 1/3 of the world's global burden of chronic respiratory conditions are in India. And there are a lot of causes for this, considering the fact that we have a lot of domestic air pollution. There is still a lot of cooking which is done on wood. Of course, there is unregulated cigarette BD smoking. People stay in poor ventilated places like the big metros where there's a lot of overcrowding. So a lot of these conditions, plus a lot of respiratory diseases, which do affect us, TB being one of the most common. And also we are now entering into a situation where we are having more and more elderly people. So it might not be that they have any conditions, but just the fact that they're older, they're frailer, they do have much more a weaker respiratory system. And it's predicted that by 2050, our 60-year-olds will grow by 300% and 80-year-olds will increase by 700%. So we are going to become a graying population in the next 30 years. So coming to the most important symptom in respiratory medicine is breathlessness. All of you know a lot about breathlessness. Just to let you know numbers, sometimes numbers is the one that makes you start thinking. Around the world, about 75 million people worldwide are affected by breathlessness. In those, at least if you see the respiratory illnesses, more than 90% of the global 65 million who have respiratory diseases suffer from breathlessness. About in incurable cancer, 50% of the 10 million with incurable cancer suffer with breathlessness, and it need not be cancer of the lung. It could be cancer of any part of the body, and it leads to breathlessness because of either anorexia cachexia syndrome or pleural effusion or lymphangitis or invasion of the lung. So various reasons. It's not just that carcinoma of the lung causes breathlessness. Also, a big chunk of breathlessness comes from cardiac diseases. So it's not just the lung, it's a lot of other conditions that contribute to breathlessness numbers. So just to let you know a brief of what you all probably already know is that the causes of breathlessness is advanced chronic lung disease, where is the airway which is affected. So it's airway diseases, interstitial diseases, alveolar conditions like congestive cardiac failure, neuromuscular conditions like motor neuron disease. So all that affects the musculature of the neuromuscular junctions, those conditions, advanced lung cancer, pleural effusion, lymphangitis, and any other cancer which leads to anorexia cachexia. Okay, so am I clear till now?
Any
Yeah.
doubts?
Shall I go on?
Yes, madam, I think so.
So coming to this very interesting and very, very important.
Yes.
Sorry?
Jija, any questions?
Audio is breaking up in between.
Oh, you can't hear now?
No, it's clear to us, Jija. Maybe
Okay.
the problem with your end.
Okay.
Okay, so I'll proceed now. So this is one of the very important and very interesting graphs of the need for palliative care in non-cancer conditions. If you see this graph, you will see 4 graphs which show the trajectories of death. So if you divide the full population, the population dies in these 4 manners. One is sudden death. And if you see the number is less than 10%, that means only 1 in 7 or 1 under 10 people of us today will die suddenly. The rest of the 9 people will go through the bed-bound phase. Now, even talking about death and dying is sometimes very, very uncomfortable for doctors because we are not used to talking about this. In our training, there is no mention about death and dying. We all need to realize that it will happen to each and every one of us. So it's very, very important to start getting comfortable discussing, talking about death and dying, especially to your patients who have chronic illnesses. The second trajectory, if you see, are terminal illnesses, which is typical of a cancer. So the patient remains well with a decent quality of life, and then there is a sudden dip or a slow dip where he requires palliative care. The focus of today's conversation is going to be the third graph, which is that of a chronic organ failure. wherein the patient is diagnosed, say, at the age of 60 or 65, for example, a COPD or an interstitial lung disease patient, or for that matter, even a chronic renal disease patient, if he's diagnosed at the age of 60 to 65, slowly and steadily, each of those dips in the third graph suggests an acute exacerbation of his illness and probably a hospitalization and an intensive care admission. But what happens with modern medicine is that the patient survives that episode, which could have been death or near death, and comes back home, but not necessarily to his original quality of life. So he lives a prolonged period with high symptom burden, frequently punctuated with hospital admissions, and slowly and steadily becomes more and more dependent on his caregivers. So he's not able to walk, he's not able to talk, he's not able to self-care, he's not able to carry out his activities of daily living. He's more and more dependent on oxygen, he needs NIV, he's more and more housebound, room-bound, bed-bound. So such a kind of life he might be leading for over 5 years, 10 years, 15 years. And you can well imagine what his psychosocial, financial, physical, mental, vocational condition will be. And that is what palliative care addresses. I'm sure all of you are aware of the general ethos of palliative care, which is to prevent health-related suffering, identify health-related suffering, not just of the patient, but also of the family, and try and address the problems that this family will go through. So you can see that chronic organ failure patients with chronic illnesses require a hand-holding for a long period of time, and that is why we need palliative care in these patients. The last graph is for frailty, which is elderly patients with dementia who live with Alzheimer's for 10 years, etc. And you realize that they slowly wither away and their needs keep slowly increasing. And it can be extremely frustrating for the caregivers to constantly look after this patient without any support. We might not be able to offer solutions for all their problems, but we can offer a lot of help by supporting them in various ways in addressing their health-related suffering. So the whole gist was that non-cancer conditions or non-communicable conditions require the attention of palliative care physicians, and more internists like yourselves need to refer patients to palliative care so they can integrate the care of these patients along with the curative care that is going on side by side, so that there is continuity of care, and towards the end the patient is not abandoned to palliative care, but the patient has a decent transition into end of life and eventually a good death, and there is a good support of the family during bereavement. Okay. So coming to assessment of breathlessness, till now I was focusing on why we need palliative care, especially in non-cancer. Now coming to breathlessness, you must realize that not all breathlessness comes under palliative care. Acute breathlessness are conditions which can be reversed, for example, asthma attacks, foreign body aspiration, trauma, etc., which causes acute, even pulmonary embolism, if treated, can be completely reversed. So those patients probably don't require palliative care. Acute and chronic are those conditions like chronic obstructive lung disease or interstitial lung disease who are chronically breathless and keep having acute exacerbations which merit hospital admissions. Correct? So those and chronic breathlessness, those patients who are breathless all the time, day after day, 365 days, are the ones which definitely require palliative care. So you can divide breathlessness into the duration, and you also have various assessment scales, the New York Heart Association, the MMRC, and the BOG scale. Now, New York Heart Association is typically used for cardiac conditions. So it's used by cardiologists. I'm sure all of you are aware of this. I will not go into the detail. New York Heart Association is classified by class 1 to class 4, while MMRC, which is used specifically for respiratory conditions, is grade 0 to grade 4. And these are all available very freely on the net. The BORG scale is one that we use when we do the 6-minute walk test as one of the assessments for breathlessness, which is basically to make the patient walk for 6 minutes at his own pace and check the amount of oxygen desaturation and the amount of breathlessness that is measured by Borg scale in the laboratory. So when you have a patient of breathlessness, of course, you will need to know the duration. So you will take all the relevant history of onset, duration, progress, aggravating, relieving factors. I don't need to go on to that. But what is important is how will you evaluate this patient and come to a conclusion of what is causing his breathlessness. So a detailed history, a clinical examination, and the basic investigations required is chest X-ray, an ECG, a complete lung function test. Very often we see that even in a metro like Bombay, lung function tests are not ordered very often. If you are situated in places where dedicated laboratories are not available and you are in private practice, you can actually invest in small bedside lung function tests because it gives you an excellent idea of what the condition of the patient is, whether it is obstructive as an airway disease, whether it is restrictive as an interstitial lung disease, whether there is reversibility, so that means it is asthma, whether there is no reversibility after bronchodilator, so you know its airways are fixed, like smoking related lung disease. So the importance of lung function is extremely important. You must request or have access to lung function. The next version, because cardiac conditions are very often contributing to breathlessness, you should request for a 2D echo, and to complete your advanced lung evaluation, if you have the facility, you must ask for a high resolution CT scan as well as an arterial blood gas, which again gives you a holistic view of whether it is a lung failure or a pump failure that is resulting in breathlessness. Any questions? All good?
Yes, please go ahead, madam.
So coming to the thinking, like for example, now, like I said, the thinking with a palliative care hat on for patients with breathlessness, we need to realize that in our training, we are only taught to ask the patient as to when he feels breathless, what causes the breathlessness, what relieves the breathlessness, is he taking his medicine, is he exposed to allergen, is there anything else? But when you are trained in palliative care, your set of questions also change, because these are the patients who are chronically breathless, who are probably bedbound and housebound, who are also depressed, who are probably died a social death before a physical one. So you need to assess the patients differently and ask how this breathlessness actually affects his life. So how it has affected his activities of daily living, because once the dependence level increases, the patients do get more and more depressed. If they have to depend on somebody to go to the toilet or somebody to give them a bath, somebody to change their clothes, so you'll realize how it can affect the patients mentally. They have a loss of role, they are socially isolated, they can become increasingly frustrated, depressed, and angry. And every time they feel breathless, they feel they're going to die. So that fear is almost always there, which is explained very beautifully by this breathing, thinking, functioning model, which is very often used in the palliative care discussions, where once the patient is chronically breathless, there is inefficient breathing and increased work of breathing with an increased respiratory rate, and all the muscles of his accessory muscles of his respiration are in use. The thing that is working over time is also his mind, the fear, the panic, the fact that he's going to die. So all those thoughts worsen the patient's breathlessness, and therefore now this patient is even scared to stand up and walk 2 steps. So more and more the patient is scared, the less and less he walks, the more and more he becomes deconditioned, and therefore the functioning of the patient is affected. So it's a vicious cycle that this patient gets caught in. The more breathless, the more anxious, and therefore the less work he does. So it results in a stage where if he doesn't use his muscles, he starts losing the muscles. So there is more and more wastage of muscles, including the accessory muscles of respiration, and then lesser and lesser amount of activity causes him more and more dyspnea. So we need to break this vicious cycle, with which we cannot do without the help of multidisciplinary team. It's not just the help of a chest physician. If you, as you can see in this model, it is very clear that you will need a physiotherapist, you will need a counselor, and you will need a palliative care input for handling this patient along with the chest physician, which comes back to the point of integrated care with all specialties. Okay, so that brings me to this point of a very interesting syndrome, which was coined by two very famous palliative care physicians from England and Australia, called the chronic breathlessness syndrome. So the definition of chronic breathlessness syndrome is those patients who continue to remain breathless, despite being on optimized evidence-based treatment for their underlying pathophysiology, with physical limitations and a whole host of psychosocial spiritual consequences because of their breathlessness, and then the duration of their breathlessness is actually not necessary. So if you can see, you can typically imagine a patient of COPD or ILD who's on all his medications and still is breathless because of his advanced stage of the disease. And with that breathlessness, you can see he'll be oxygen bound, he'll be bed bound, sometimes NIV bound, not able to talk, not able to walk. So those are the chunk of patients whom we call as chronic breathlessness, where whatever medications you give, the patients continue to remain breathlessness. And that comes under the purview of a shared care. Sorry?
No, madam, please continue.
So this comes under the purview of a shared care of palliative as well as pulmonologists. Okay. So how do we, or how do I now look after these patients? It is almost always along with the pulmonologist. And we go through this entire session of how his breathlessness has changed his life, take down of what is his biggest fears, what does he want from doctors, because it's different for different people. And then we get down to managing dyspnea. So we talk to him about relaxation, so breathing techniques, physiotherapist, slowly improving his endurance by graded gradual exercise, get the counselor if he's depressed, have sessions, give antidepressants if the patient is extremely depressed, then advise the family of what they can do to control the acute worsening of this chronic breathlessness. So positioning of the patient, blowing a fan in the patient's face, loose clothes, massaging the patient. Sometimes patients feel good with acupressure. Sometimes patients feel good with acupuncture, music therapy, pet therapy, certain distractions, keeping near a window, keeping the window open, so feeling less claustrophobic. So these are the things we try and support the patient. So all these things can be done on a regular basis so that patients don't keep going into their acute exacerbations. Okay. The pharmacological ones, of course, I'm sure all of you know, which is bronchodilators, steroids in acute exacerbation. If the patient is not able to take inhalers, give nebulizers. Give oxygen if the patient has demonstrated low oxygen saturation. Antibiotics in cases of infection. Continue the antifibrotics. And the most important thing that I will be talking about is morphine. Very often, again, in our training, we are not taught the pharmacodynamics of morphine. Therefore, doctors fear the use of morphine, especially in breathlessness. They feel morphine is going to cause respiratory depression and eventually high carbon dioxide and death. In my 3 years of practice, and I'm sure all these people in Pallium India will vouch that in all their years of practice, they've never ever seen the respiratory depression because of the safety with which we use the morphine, the doses in which we use the morphine. So, like I was saying, very often people believe that morphine causes the reduced ventilatory response, causes hypercapnia, hypoxia, and therefore depression of respiration and respiratory deaths. But when we started at very, very low doses, which is again a very important principle of palliative care, start low, go slow, and slowly titrate the use of morphine every week by 25%, along with laxatives. You have to give laxatives because patients with chronic breathlessness do not have the strength to push, and morphine will and does cause constipation. Okay? So the mechanism of how we use morphine, I can share this presentation. I think Pallium India already has this presentation. They can share it with you. It's just a simple way of how we use morphine, and it can be given orally and subcutaneously or intravenously, but in palliative care, we prefer subcut or oral if the patient can take it. And if we suspect anxiety, we add a medium acting benzodiazepine, and the patient is panicking, we add a longer acting benzodiazepine. But you must remember, please always correct the correctables, and secondly, use non-pharmacological abundantly, like positioning, like clothing, like fan, like a window, like distraction therapy before, along with your pharmacological interventions. Okay. So very often there is a myth about using morphine, not just with patients, their family, as well as doctors. Doctors feel scared to prescribe. Patients feel giving morphine is end of life. But it is not so. There is a lot about morphine that we are not taught about. It's important to understand the pharmacodynamics before we start prescribing morphine, and that's an entire different session. Okay. So morphine is a wonder drug. If you search the internet, you find huge amount of research to suggest the highly statistical significant positive effect that oral opioids, low dose, has in chronic breathlessness. The patients experience a whole new life where, in their given circumstances, just the fact that they can go to the toilet without feeling that their world will collapse, or eat at the dining table with their family, such simple things where we can improve the quality of life of patients with chronic breathlessness, where they can complete one full sentence on the phone, they can talk to their loved one on the phone without stopping 20 times. These are the things that we aim to do, because we are not able to cure their underlying illness. And there is hardly any evidence of raise in carbon dioxide when used in low dose, when adjusted gradually, and when there is frequent review and evaluation. Okay, so this is morphine, which is used for chronic breathlessness, where patients live with this chronic breathlessness. But morphine and midazolam is also used very often in terminal breathlessness, where we explain to the patient and the family that it is distressing for the patient to go through those difficult symptoms and the family to watch those symptoms. So we use this in a syringe driver over 24 hours and slowly increase the dosage of morphine so that patient is comfortable and is sedated, and the intention is to give the patient comfort and alleviate his distressing symptoms. The intent is not to kill, but however, you all know the doctrine of double effect. Sometimes we also time it in such a way that the patient does eventually pass off, and that is what is called as palliative sedation. This is that entity used very often in the West, and it is not that common in India, but with proper patient selection, with proper discussion, and with proper communication and documentation, it is an effective way of making patients comfortable and giving them a good death once we take their best interest in mind. So the aim is not to hasten death. The most important thing is to give them comfort. The most important thing is to support the family through that. So it is something that you can consider if you have a palliative care trained personal nurse, physiotherapist, psychologist, as well as a doctor in your team of treating doctors in the ICU, where you decide not to go through aggressive treatment, shift the patient to the ward, and palliative sedation can be one of your effective tools to make the patient comfortable and avoid unnecessary, futile, medical aggressive treatment in patients with poor outcomes. Okay. So like I mentioned before, when there is breathlessness with anxiety, we use midazolam. And when there is secretions, which is very, very often seen in patients with respiratory diseases, we use either hyoscine or glycopyrrolate, depending on what kind of secretions they are. For example, whether it's terminal secretions or whether it's saliva, and whether there is a contraindication to use either. They work effectively when given subcutaneously. Suction can be extremely traumatic, and it is advisable with the consultation of a palliative care physician to use these drugs to decrease the secretion so that patients can be comfortable, patients do not aspirate, and the whole oropharynx is not traumatized by frequent suctioning. So there are medications this is the most interesting part of palliative care, where you have multidisciplinary team inputs. It's not that the doctor is the one all and end all. Secondly, the way we use certain medications, the extra use of the indications of these medications, which can be used in a palliative care approach to decrease patients' distressing symptoms. And it's quite a joy. Very often people say, don't you get upset? Isn't it morbid to always almost talk and be with dying people? But the satisfaction that you get to make a dying person comfortable, and the faces of the family members to see their loved ones die in peace, is a very different thing. It's not the same as when you see people in ICU who are struggling, you're torturing them, especially unindicated. There is a whole list of medical futility that goes on in our ICUs. ICUs are lifesavers. We need ICUs to get back our patients who are salvageable to their original good quality life. But all of you will agree that 25% of our ICU admissions are those patients who shouldn't have been in the ICU in the first place. We are blocking those beds and preventing people who can be salvaged and go back into the society and lead a productive life. So that is the way we need to look at palliative care. It's not only talking about death. We are pro-life and we want to improve the quality of life till death, and that is what is important. Okay, so this is about breathlessness. If there's no question, I will go ahead and continue the other symptoms of respiratory medicine. Should I just carry on?
Yeah. We will give them chance to ask doubts at the end.
Okay. So coming to the second most common symptom is the cough. And like you all know that it is very much needed. It is a normal protective reflex and prevents foreign bodies, prevents aspiration, but anything in excess is dangerous. So where it becomes pathological when it is constantly there, when it disturbs the activities of daily living, when patients have other associated symptoms, patients are unable to talk, sleep, and carry out their normal activities. So cough again is not just a condition, symptom which is arising from the lung. It can come from various, so respiratory, upper respiratory, ear, nose, gastric, cardiac, psychogenic. And also, of course, post-treatment. So there are drugs which can cause cough. There is post-radiation. So you need a complete history when you're assessing cough. Very, very important. So when it comes to treatment, of course, you need to know the type of cough, dry cough, wet cough, what is it that you need to know what are the conditions, what the patient is actually suffering from. So there are, for chronic intractable cough, there are certain conditions like you can use saline or you can use mucolytics, etc. But other things that you could use is locally you could use menthol, lozenges, etc. But centrally acting, so morphine, codeine, dextromethorphan, these are used actively in chronic intractable cough. And especially when patients have frequent cough syncopes or they have issues where it affects their activities of daily living, like radiation fibrosis. There is no cure for radiation fibrosis. So you can give these medications to decrease the intractable cough. The pharmacological things that you could use are, of course, rationalize the use of inhalers. Morphine, again, works very well. The benzodiazepines at night so that the patient does not have cough. In case of psychogenic cough, we've also attempted the use of SSRIs or citalopram orally, which can cause a reduction in cough. One of the other medications which has now been tried and there are enough reports is gabapentin. Gabapentin used in the doses of 300 milligrams 3 times a day is known to be effective in preventing cough. And the important thing about gabapentin is also causes sleep. So the patient does have a good night's rest and also has the cough addressed. But please be sure that there are subsect of people who probably can't afford gabapentin. And in those people, probably diazepam, probably morphine is a much cheaper alternative to use for treating intractable cough. And please always, in the cases of chronic cough, go through the drug history of the patient. There might be something there which contributes to the cough, like angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors, which causes cough. Okay, so cough is again something which is parallel to breathlessness. The only additional things are codeine, diazepam, escitalopram, as well as gabapentin that can be used. Then coming to pleural effusion. You all know transudate, exudates, metastatic pleural effusion that can come from the lung, the breast, the bone, etc. As well as other causes of pleural effusion, which could be rheumatoid, renal, pancreatic CAs, it could be trauma, multiple causes of pleural effusion. This is just an academic interest to show the different colors of pleural effusion and the causes, which is probably not important. But what is important is how do we manage? So very importantly, it depends on the size of the pleural effusion. So if it's very small pleural effusion, not causing anything, we just can observe. Suppose the pleural effusion is moderate to severe, then the management depends on the patient's prognosis. So the patient's prognosis is very, very guarded. So less than 4 weeks, you just give him temporary relief by aspirating it once. But if the patient is going to live more than 1 month or 6 weeks and he's got a decent performance status, then you can put an intercostal drain and drain it and try to do a pleurodesis with talc. But if the patient's prognosis is good and he's repeatedly filling, then we need to do a proper intervention, do a thoracoscopic intervention, put a long-term pigtail, and then tap the full fluid and dry it with talc or keep that indwelling catheter so that the patient is not going to keep having to go to the hospital to drain his pleural fluid. So a lot depends on the size and the amount of fluid, the patient's prognosis, and the patient's symptoms. Sometimes patients are not getting up at all to feel breathless. In those patients, we don't need to go and do an intervention unless the patient is breathless even without moving out of his bed. Okay? So, like I said, depends on the cause, how can management, and it's best managed by severity, performance status, and the prognosis of the patient. Then comes to hemoptysis. Of course, all of you know that it is another common thing, especially in a country with a lot of tuberculosis. It's seen as a sequelae of tuberculosis, as well as one of the common symptoms in lung cancer patients. The most scary part of hemoptysis is that patients do die of loss of blood, but more often they die of aspiration of the blood. And it can be very scary to have blood pouring out of your at high pressures, because when you throw blood from the pulmonary system, it comes at the rate from the bronchial artery. So it's at the rate of the systemic blood pressure. So it can be quite a jet when it comes out. So it's quite scary, and it's a very important thing to learn how to manage. There's some certain things that are now advanced in the management of hemoptysis is, of course, local radiotherapy, external beam radiation, which can all be palliative. And endobronchially, there are things that we can do like brachytherapy, like laser, like cryotherapy, as well as bronchial artery embolization. But the important thing is how you manage. The words you use also for patients, you must empathize, support the patient, keep bloods ready, pints ready, cross-matched ready. And when you do a procedure, you can also give the patient the tranexamic acid, as well as inject tranexamic acid when you do endobronchoscopically, so that the blood can stop. Because once you do a fiber optic bronchoscope, you might not be able to see clearly the vision because of the pouring blood. You can use this drug so that you have a clearer view of then going in and doing these various procedures. Then, just to complete the list, it is hiccups, which is basically an abnormal contraction of the diaphragm, usually due to hyperacidity, and therefore further investigations required is GI endoscopy and GI CT scan of the thorax and abdomen, and also of the endoscopy of the stomach. But most important is to decrease the gastric stimulation. So you basically dilute the acid. You can use bicarbonates. Earlier, we used to do Ryle's tube and bicarbonates, but you can use drugs like gabapentin or metoclopramide, and other drugs like sodium valproate, haloperidol, and midazolam in the treatment of hiccups. Okay, so that is just a brief overview of what we can do to palliate symptoms of respiratory diseases with a focus on breathlessness, which is one of the commonest symptoms seen across specialities, and introduction to you to chronic breathlessness syndrome, and not to be scared to use morphine in safe doses, extremely effective, and it's a wonder drug and a life savior for patients who have no cure of their underlying conditions. Over to you, Sunil.
Thank you, madam. If you have any doubts, please ask now. So, madam talked about many symptoms in respiratory symptom. So, please ask your doubts.
Madam, about the breathlessness, you have talked about when to give the patient to the palliative care, but I am not sure, is it when the case become chronic or constant like that, only then we have to send to the palliative care, or is there any other criteria like that?
Excellent. I'm so happy you asked me this. Usually breathlessness can be an entire topic on its own, but because it was respiratory, I had to rush through it. Which part of the country do you come from?
No, I'm from Manipur, madam. Manipur, madam.
Okay, excellent.
Manipur, yeah.
The reason why I'm asking you this is because this is a very important point of when we should refer to palliative care, correct? So a lot of research has been done in the UK, of which I'm sure Sunil can share you papers, and they have come up with this thing called as the gold standard framework. Now, and also Manipal Hospital in India has come up with something called as the Blue Maple, which basically lists all the chronic conditions like motor neuron, Parkinson's, Alzheimer's, renal, liver, COPD, heart, etc. And there are certain indicators of when to refer to palliative care. So, for example, in a COPD, it is when you have an age more than 75, multiple admissions in the past year, patient dependent on oxygen, patient's lung function deteriorated by certain values. So if the patient satisfies even two of those criteria, it is time to refer to palliative care. That is one interesting paper that you should read, which is Gold Standard Framework or Blue Maple from Manipal. That is point number one. The other topic that they have researched is very often patients and family feel disheartened when you say go to palliative care because they say abhi to main marne wala hu. So there is a very interesting question where doctors in the UK, especially family physicians, are trained to ask in their minds, will you be surprised if this patient is not alive in the next 1 year from where you're seeing him? See, you are the doctor, correct? You have seen 100 more patients of COPD and interstitial lung compared to the patient and the family. So you have the responsibility and you have the intelligence to think this patient is already 80, he has diabetes, he has a heart problem, he's got into ICU 3-4 times. It's unlikely that he's going to survive more and more admissions. So if the answer to this surprise question is no, if you're not going to be surprised that this patient is not going to be alive in the next 1 year, that is the time to start referral to palliative care.
Okay.
Did you get me?
Yes, madam.
For example, it's like pregnancy, right? In 9 months, lady knows that 9th month, the labor will start, the pain will start. I know I have to pack a bag, which doctor to go. So it is constant, programming in the mind. Similarly, like I told you before, all of us are going to die. Patients with chronic illnesses, the probability is higher. Therefore, if you give yourself and the patient's family time to discuss, 1 year time to discuss, ask the patient's beliefs, ask the patient's fears, what is important to him, discuss it with the family and come down with the thing that in an emergency, if this is what you want, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, this is what we will do, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then there's no confusion. Today, what is happening? We don't discuss about it. We wait for emergencies to happen. And in an emergency, all the wrong decisions get done. And everybody who shouldn't be in ICU is in ICU.
Yes. Yeah.
Correct? So, if you have a patient who has a chronic disease, which is going to be incurable, who's going to, he's becoming worse and worse, that is the time to start the referral and discussion on palliative care. So, please look up this gold standard framework, Blue Maple, and the surprise question that was actually researched in UK, so that you in your mind ask yourself, will I be surprised if this patient is dead in the next 1 year or not alive? If the patient you'd feel is not going to be alive, it's time to start proactive palliative care.
Okay, madam. Yeah.
Anybody else? Many of, Dr. Jijo?
Madam, can you tell us something about the judicious use of a pulse oximeter in our wards when we use it?
So I think the pulse oximeter has become the buzzword with this COVID-19 also. I think the sales have hit the roof because now we have the happy hypoxics in COVID-19, right? They're stable and then suddenly they crash. So pulse oximeter is a very vital tool. Finger pulse oximeter is a portable, excellent tool. We should judiciously use it because some patients are constantly measuring it and then they will keep texting you, mine is now 82, 84. So it can be a bit of a nuisance. But in your ward, it's an extremely good tool. So any oxygen reading which is less than 88 means that this patient requires oxygen during activity. So chronically ill patient, you need to maintain the oxygen between 88 and 92. Below 88, he will go into pulmonary hypertension much sooner. So that is where the role of long-term oxygen therapy comes. In your ward, it also helps to detect somebody who is unnecessarily using oxygen. You don't need to have oxygen at 98 and 99 in a 85-year-old with multiple comorbidities. You need to maintain between 88 and 92. Remember, excess use of oxygen is so dangerous. It causes nascent oxygen radicals, free radicals, which cause destruction. So everything needs to be used judiciously. If you have hypoxemia, use oxygen. At the same time, don't yank up the thing to 4 and 5 because you don't need oxygen up to 98 and 99. Third, in a patient who has a tendency for high carbon dioxide retention, the more oxygen you use, the more chances of CO2 to rise. So these are the things you can use the pulse oximeter. Secondly, it also picks up persistent tachycardia. Now, if you have persistent tachycardia in a patient, either he is anxious or there is something else contributing to his hypoxia, which could be pulmonary embolism. So pulse oximeter should be given to all doctors, and it might not be as important as a stethoscope, but I think in the COVID situation, it is becoming as important as a stethoscope. Is that clear, Jijo? Hello?
Thank you.
Madam, in what we are also using pulmonary function test, what all necessary precautions we should take regarding sterilization technique, etc. in this COVID era?
So there are filters already inbuilt in the PFT machine. If you have a big dedicated lab, there are filters. But otherwise, you can use mouthpieces. And now you can use mouthpieces which are surrounded by plastic and chuck the whole thing, which is cardboard mouthpieces.
Okay. And one more doubt, ma'am. Usually in spinal cord injury patients, percentage predicted FVC is found to be lesser, almost in the range 60 to 70%, but the patient is still stable and SBCs are all normal. Is it a common phenomenon?
So that's the thing. You cannot interpret a pulmonary function test report without the patient's clinical condition. So if you know there's a spinal cord injury, obviously you will get a restrictive disease. Okay, but X-ray, the patient's chest is clear. Patient has no other respiratory problems. X-ray is clear. ABG is showing, only hypoxia, not type 2 respiratory. So you have to interpret it always, almost with clinical correlation. You can't interpret PFT standalone. Never.
Okay.
Anybody else?
Madam, is sodium chloride inhalation for cough? Does it always work for cough? Is it?
So it doesn't always work, but you can try. Sometimes the removal of secretions, the pooling of the secretions can be treated by the inhalation. But with cough, it can be a difficult symptom to manage. So you have to do step by step. And I think frequent evaluation and review is important. So sometimes it could also be that the underlying condition is not treated properly or the inhaler technique is wrong. So if those adjustments are also done, then you might not go into the chronic cough management. But I think a lot is desired of doctors to educate patients of how to take inhalers, how much to take, the technique of taking, to recheck the technique of taking, etc., so that it's a optimal benefit to the patient. And then you go to the other steps of which if there are any drugs or acidity or if they're eating dinner late, and then slowly build up to the other medications like sodium this thing in nebulization or gabapentin or codeine or morphine.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Madam, is there a choice for steroids in case of um,
Respiratory condition.
non-malignant condition and malignant conditions?
See, no. I don't. So, for respiratory conditions, in non-malignant conditions, the main problem is airway inflammation, and in acute exacerbations of interstitial lung disease. So, we are very happy using, if the patient is able to swallow orally, we are happy using Visolone or methylprednisolone or solumedrol if it's injectable. But in cases of cancer, I think this thing is more to decrease the pressure in certain tight compartment areas like the spinal cord compression, etc. So the use of steroids is different. But in lung conditions, we are happy using Visolone or methylpred or solumedrol to decrease airway inflammation. Even in lymphangitis, I think methylpred or solumedrol works well because it is basically an exaggerated inflammatory response in the lung, and it settles with uh, these steroids, this group of steroids. I think that is also a part of the discussion now of the ARDS developed with COVID, is the use of steroids. I think a lot of debate is going on that also. Because
Yeah.
we do use, in some ARDS patients, we do use steroids. Of course, under the cover of antibiotics.
So in COVID, there is a thought that it is due to microvascular embolism, something like that.
Yeah, I think one of the mechanisms where patients suddenly deteriorate is the microvascular embolization, which is where they say they are using low molecular weight heparin. And those are the ones which are happy hypoxic. They remain well for a long time and suddenly crash because of the PE and blocking of all the vessels.
Anybody else?
Madam, Madam,
Yes.
since breathlessness, it's very distressing for the patient and it's also discomfort for the bystanders who observe it. And so they frequently take the patient to casualty for injections and all. And how far we can provide a home support for this patient? considering the economical status from the poor to the rich people? Any specific equipments to suggest?
So another important question, especially in the palliative care approach. So if it's an acute breathlessness, you must go to casualty. Young patient, acutely breathless, otherwise fine, there is no doubt. The doubts come when the patient is a chronically ill patient and keeps getting progressively worse. So it's important to have had the discussions with the patient, the family, before deciding against aggressive treatment or intensive care treatment. One. Two, you have to have identified the full loop of whom the patient and the family will contact in a situation, because idea is patient comfort. We can't let the patient be uncomfortable just because he's decided he doesn't want any aggressive treatment. Correct? So you have to have involve the family GP. You have had to talk with the family GP. Then you have to go through stepwise treatment with the patient and the family. That if you get breathless, first assume one particular position that is comfortable to the patient, then loosen clothes, fan over the face, take a dose of this nebulizer, take one dose of steroid, or so those points, action points, have to be written for the patient. Then they know when to start the morphine. So all those things have to have been discussed. It's like almost rehearsed. Like, you know how you go on stage, ye hua, to you should know exactly what to do when, and the patient also needs to know, and the family needs to know. The biggest problem is they get panic because they don't know what to do. You and me will also panic if you don't know what to do. If we have talked about it, if we have discussed it, if we have an action plan, then we know exactly what to do, whom to contact, which medicines to give, when to give oxygen, when to give nebulizers. So currently that is what I do when pulmonologists refer me these patients. First is to understand what the patient knows about his condition. Second thing is to understand what are the patient's biggest problems in life. Third is what does he want solutions for? Because I'm not God. I cannot offer solution for everything. Then talk to the patient and the family about end of life care. What are the goals of care? What should we do? What should we not do? List it out. Talk to the GP. Close the loop so that they know. Suppose it's at 2 a.m. They cannot call you at 2 a.m. as a palliative care physician. They will have to call the GP. The GP should know what to do. So these things have to be clear cut so that we avoid unnecessary casualty visits. And it is very true. Breathlessness, which goes undiscussed by a specialist, is the highest reason for unplanned casualty visits. And in the COVID situation, you're not only risking this elderly patient or a chronically ill patient and the family, it's an unnecessary visit to the hospital when really nothing can be done.
Madam, if there is a nebulizer and stock of steroid inhalation and bronchodilator, can they manage many of those acute attacks at home itself?
So I think in a chronic breathlessness, you also need to add morphine, nebulizer, oxygen, maybe NIV, bronchodilator, steroids, and morphine. Because low dose morphine works very well. And once the patient is comfortable, the relatives also stop panicking.
Okay. When do you use morphine in a patient with COPD?
So COPD we use in stage 4, stage 5 when they're chronically breathless, and we assess. So we do the PFT, we do the ABG, and we do the 6-minute walk test. We see the patient is using oxygen. If the patient is breathless at rest, we start using low dose morphine.
Okay. Are there any more questions?
Excuse me, can I ask question?
Yes.
Excuse me, madam. Let me ask a doubt. That is, we always have a common tendency to supplement oxygen when we find out that the saturation is very low. So, but actually, we specifically don't know what amount of oxygen should be, how many liters at various saturation levels. So, ma'am, could you please help us with that?
So the point is you should use oxygen when the oxygen saturation is lower than 88. Okay.
Okay, madam.
And always start low.
How many liters of oxygen?
Yeah. So you need to start at 0.5 to 1 liter. and you maintain the
okay, ma'am.
oxygen between 88 and 92. You don't need 96, 97.
Okay, okay, ma'am. So we can maintain at a level of 92 to 95.
Yeah,
Oh,
92 is
oh,
more than enough if the patient is. So
oh,
you start 0.5, then 1, then 2. Very rarely you will need to go to 5 and 6. You need to go to 5 and 6 when there's a really terminal ILD who has really no lung left.
okay, ma'am. Okay, thank you.
So you need to maintain only between 88 and 92.
Oh, okay, ma'am.
Should we
So,
go to the case?
yeah, let's move on to the patient story, which will be presented by Dr. Anjana. So, Anjana, it's over to you. And please share the patient story.
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Can I start?
Yes, please.
Next slide. Cases are spinal cord injury, traumatic incomplete flaccid tetraplegia, neurological level of injury is C4, surgically fixed with neurogenic bowel and bladder and gluteal and sacral pressure source of grade 4. Next slide. The presenting complaint is weakness of all four limbs since 4 months, bed sore buttocks and lower back region since 3 months. The history of illness, patient fell giddy in his boat and while at sea. He fell hitting his head at a side of boat and developed weakness of all four limbs with altered sensation below neck. He reached medical college Program 2 hours after the incident. Here imaging was done, applied, and he was admitted to ICU. His bladder was catheterized and diapers applied. After 24 days, surgery was done for spine. He had an episode of fever and breathlessness post-operatively. Antibiotics and supportive measures were given, and he needed ICD insertion. After a few days, symptoms subsided. He was in ICU for nearly 4 weeks. And then he was discharged to a local hospital. From there, PT was started. He had minimal recovery of upper limb movements only, and he developed bed sores over his buttocks area and lower back. And he was managed by daily dressings. He was discharged and sent home after 1 month. From there, the bed sore worsened. He had milling discharge from the sore, and later he was referred, and subsequently he was admitted in a PMR department. And the past history, no history of any comorbidities. The personal history, he was an alcoholic, an occasional smoker, bladder was under CBD, bowel on diapers, passes to he uses laxatives, sleep is disturbed, he has nightmares, appetite is poor, diet is mixed. The socioeconomic and vocational history, his pre-morbid occupation was fisherman. He studied up to 5th. He does not know any other job. He's a religious person. He lost his wife in an accident 8 years. He has 2 sons. Elder one is a fisherman and other is a polytechnic student. And he lives in a house. And the functional status, he lacks bed mobility, supine to sit, he can supine to sit with support present, he lacks sitting balance, dependent completely in self-care, transfer and ambulation, bladders on CBD and bowel on diapers. And the examination, vitals, a pulse 80 per minute, BP 126/80, respiratory rate is 26, febrile, SpO2 is 96, and the general examination is obese patient, has pallor, no uterus, cyanosis, clubbing, lymphadenopathy, edema, elevated JVP. Head to foot examination, normal except sore is present, pressure sacral sore is present and is on CBD. Local examination, pressure sore grade 4 over both gluteal region, size 5 into 6 centimeter and 4 into 5 centimeter with slough. And the pressure sore grade 4 over sacral area, 5 into 5 centimeter with slough. And the CNS examination, high mental function, he cries frequently and the mood is depressed. Cranial normal, upper limb is tone is flaccid, lower limb also tone flaccid, upper limb grade 2 power, lower limb grade 0 power, sensory, light touch and pinprick impaired from C5 onwards, deep tendon reflex is absent, plantar bilateral mute, BCR is brisk. Musculoskeletal examination, there is bilateral TA tightness, a respiratory system, air entry bilaterally equal, no added sounds, single breath count is 16, chest expansion is 2 centimeter, CVS S1, S2 normal, no murmurs, GIT per abdomen non-tender, no organomegaly, bowel sounds, genital urinary external genitalia is normal. And the investigations is MRI cervical spine, there was fracture C5 vertebra with grade 1 androlisthesis of C4 over C5 and minimal retrolisthesis of C5 over C6, causing spinal canal narrowing, hemorrhagic cord contusion and cord edema, hemoglobin of 7.4, hypoproteinemia and hypoalbuminemia present. First culture showed pseudomonas. As the treatment, he was placed on a spinal cord injury rehab program. Bronchodilators were continued. IV antibiotics was started, and then oral antibiotics. Blood transfusion done. Twice daily dressing with frequent wound debridement done. Diet modifications, PROM exercises, angle splinting, DVT prophylaxis was given. Incentive spirometry and chest percussion. Bladder was on CBD. Bowel. The bowel program was started. He was discharged at request for personal reasons. The psychosocial aspect, he was a major breadwinner of the family. He had nightmares frequently. He cries a lot and considered himself to be a burden for his sons. Education and job of his sons affected. Both are needed for his care, and he longs to go to church. The medications, he was on antibiotics, bronchodilators, laxatives, and daily dressing was done for pressure sore. The main concern is the healing of the sores, a depressed mood of the patient, and job and education of his son. The summary, a 54-year-old male with neck trauma and a sustained cervical spinal cord injury with tetraplegia, which was surgically fixed. He had episodes of respiratory tract infection, has neurogenic bowel and bladder dysfunction. He developed grade 4 pressure sore over both gluteal region and sacral region, lacks bed mobility, supine to seat dependent, lacks sitting balance, dependent self-care, transfers, and ambulation. The discussion points, respiratory issues in tetraplegics and the role of immunization, tackling fear of death in a palliative patient, and the recreation options in a bedridden patient, and the criteria for discharging a patient with pressure sores. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a question, why the patient had a ICD?
He had effusion.
Okay. So,
Was it due to the
is it-
trauma? Was it due to the trauma?
He developed fever and breathlessness post-surgery.
is it due to pneumonia?
Either it could be hospital-acquired pneumonia, which caused the parapneumonic effusion. But he was also on bronchodilators. Why was he on bronchodilators if he didn't have an airway problem? All breathless patients, pneumonia patients don't need to be given bronchodilators, right?
Maybe
His breath
because
is-
tetraplegia, high spinal.
Sorry?
He had a high spinal cord injury. Maybe that is contributing.
Yeah, but how will bronchodilators help in spinal cord injury? Beta 2 agonists and muscarinic agents will not help. Secondly, his hemoglobin was low. That itself could have contributed to the breathlessness. Now, bronchodilators, how will it help in a spinal cord injury patient? Because diaphragm will be affected. Diaphragm is not going to do anything. Nothing is going to happen to the diaphragm if you give salbutamol and tiotropium and ipravent. So sometimes I think we also end up using nebulization whenever we see any breathless patient. Have to have an assessment of breathlessness. If it is an airway disease, Because even in an interstitial lung disease, parenchymal disease, it is not going to make a difference to give inhaled steroid and inhaled bronchodilator. How is it going to make a difference? Because the parenchyma of the lung that is affected. So we need to, this is another discussion, Sunil. Even last time when we had the echo session, there were lots of questions on breathlessness management general. It might not even be palliative. There's a lot of, we need to have a lot of clarity on when to use oxygen, when to use beta 2, when to use long acting beta 2, you know, because all breathless patients don't have an airway problem. Airway problem will be solved by inhaler. You get what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Respiratory issues in tetraplegics, yes. What immunization are you talking about?
Pneumococcal influenza.
So the point is, we usually give for people above 65, or we give people with chronic respiratory conditions, patients who are going to be at home because tetraplegics are not going to go around. So you can give them, I think the most important thing is physiotherapy to prevent pooling of secretions, change position, that also will help the bed sores, pooling of secretions, and you know, those kind of physiotherapy where you drain the pulmonary secretions. There is a role of immunization, but I think in a country like India, where universal program of immunization is kind of not 100%, such patients, I don't think at 50 he needs immunization. Unless he's a diabetic, unless he's got other chronic ailments, unless he's an alcoholic. He used to drink alcohol, but I don't think he's alcoholic. So you have to use this also judiciously. You should give all patients above 65, but at 50, it might not be the 100%. I think prevention is better. So, you know, the care of the patient, hygiene, position change, physiotherapy, those things are probably more important.
What all are the respiratory issues that this patient can?
That depending on the level, so this was C4, C5, right? So C5, C6 is the nerve supply for diaphragm. So when the diaphragm is going to get involved, they will be breathless. They will have type 2 respiratory failure. So they might need an artificial non-invasive ventilator to breathe, like how it is in when you have sleep apnea. So they can have a lot, because of the constant lying down, there's a lot of pooling of secretions, so they can get infected. Then because of the fact that there is no movement at all, there is disuse atrophy of the respiratory muscles. So obviously the accessory muscles of respiration are also going to waste. Plus they could have even aspiration issues that cause aspiration pneumonia, because they're also going to be lying down in bed and eating. So it could be multiple. It could be aspiration, it could be muscular, it could be type 2 respiratory failure. It also, so those are the kind of conditions that we expect in a tetraplegia. So very often they also probably do require breathing assistance like tracheostomy, etc. Right? Some of them, if it's higher the cord, then you need to give them airway security. Anybody wants to add more? I could have missed out. And Kerala are the more people who see more tetraplegics. I haven't seen that many.
Any of you are seeing any more issues other than what Madam told? No. Jijo? No?
Yeah, mostly these are the common things we see. Mostly,
But how do you think you can tackle fear of death in a palliative patient? Now, it's not just, sorry?
No, please go on, Madam.
No. So we need to realize this, any tetraplegic, it need not be a palliative patient. Imagine he's only 60, he's not able to do so many things, he's totally dependent. It is very depressing and frustrating. So I think right from the beginning, we need to have counselors. We need to try to see whether we can if there whether we can do things to keep him engaged, use his skills. For example, his son can learn some skills of his net making or fisherman because he can talk. So those kind of things we need to identify the fact that he's going to get depressed and frustrated much early and start acting on it with counselors in on board, and see to it that we can use his intelligence and experience effectively. Because that, like for example, introduction of recreations early, what can we do for these patients? Maybe music, maybe pet, maybe TV, reading out newspapers. You said he's very religious, he likes to go to church, so if his church chaplain can come home maybe once in 6 weeks, once in 8 weeks, talk to him about spiritual pain, aspects of spiritual life, maybe he'll at least feel connected to God. We can listen to hymns, chanting, etc. Because it's very difficult for him to be taken out on a regular basis. So maybe somebody can come home. So if these things are started early, I think what happens in these patients who take a long time to recover, a lot of time is focused on improving them. Even doctors, because we are trained to cure, we forget that side of physio, we forget that side of psychosocial well-being, which has to go along with the side of the surgery, the curative, those things have to go hand in hand. You can't say, okay, first I will fix the spine, then I will fix the mind. By the time the mind is completely dejected and ready to jump off, so it has to be simultaneous, which is where we talk of integrated. So palliative care, psychosocial aspects, care of the family. It must be very frustrating for the sons at young age. They also haven't started their family. There is no lady in the house. So they have to do the cooking, cleaning, looking after this man. It must be very frustrating. And we also overlook the burden of caregiving in this country. We feel children have to look after the father. It's not necessary that it is possible to do so every time, year after year. So these are all the things that we need to take into account, because this patient is going to be.
Madam, your sound is very feeble.
You can't hear?
Now it's okay.
So I'm saying that in India, we focus on the curative and then start on the supportive.
Again, it's feeble now.
Is it better?
Yeah.
Maybe I move too much. So we need to start supportive treatment along with curative. This patient is going to be like this for a long time. We have to support the family. We have to think of all that to do to see to that his mental status doesn't get depressed. It cannot start after the curative. It has to start sideways, which is very important. You cannot address these issues once they have developed. You have to try and prevent these issues side by side, because this is a long-term problem. It is not going to go away.
Fear of death, I think we have to ask the people what they fear of. Actually, the process of death or during death, are they going to suffer? Are they going to be breathless? Will I be in pain? So there will be many concerns regarding the death itself. So it is important to explore why or what are the causes that make them frightened regarding death, and we have to answer that questions, and yeah.
Anybody else wants to add anything? I think there's one more point, na Sunil, the criteria for discharging. Criteria for discharging patients with a bed sore.
Yeah. I think they admit a lot of patients with who has pressure sore. So any of you can comment on this?
You all are more trained than I am.
Yeah. Anybody from PMR?
Usually we wait till the size of the pressure sore has decreased, and when it is about grade 2, we discharge them and we make sure the bystander is able to manage it. Many a times the bystanders may not be willing for discharge unless they see a complete closure of the wound. That happens quite often.
But it will take long time, isn't it? If there is
Yeah.
a grade 4 pressure sore.
Yes.
So what we do is,
Tips
if
for prevention, like air mattress, dressing material, for foul smelling discharges. So I think they need the hand holding, and if possible, a nurse going frequently to see to that they're doing a good job, sterilizing those the gauze pads, the Gamgee pads, etc.
Yeah.
Even correction of hemoglobin, good nutrition helps the wound healing.
So we also get a lot of patients with the pressure sore, not only because of paraplegia or tetraplegia, or because of frailty also. So what we do is, if there are any tissues to be debrided, that will be done, and then the pressure sore will be clean, and then we will empower the caregiver to do the pressure sore dressing. And once they are confident, we will discharge them. We will not keep them a long time because of the limited availability of bed, and we will follow up with the home care team. So that's what we usually do. Anything else?
Does Anjana want to add anything?
Anybody else want to add any more points? No. Do you have anything more to say, madam?
No, I'm fine. I mean, it's always nice to talk about pulmonology. Breathlessness is something I really is close to my heart. I'm very passionate about it. So please, if you, Sunil, can share that gold standard framework and the blue maple or the surprise question, then it'll give them an incentive to start referring patients about end of life and goals as well.
So thank you, madam, for being with us today and highlighting the respiratory issues in many patients. And thank you, Dr. Anjana, for presenting the patient story. So before you leave, please do this feedback questionnaire and submit it. I hope all of you can see the questionnaire.
Thank you.
Thank you, madam.